Hello, I'm Tim Richardson with the Walker Church of Christ in Walker, Louisiana. I appreciate you joining me for a period of Bible study. I do hope you'll excuse the fact that there may possibly be some background noise. It is, at the time of this recording, the 4th of July, and there are still those in the area that are shooting fireworks, and occasionally there's traffic that goes by, and so I hope the noise won't be too distracting to you. In the last few weeks, we've been looking at some things from the book of Matthew. Particularly last week, we looked at some of the parables that Jesus told, and particularly the significance of those. And one of them that we considered in Matthew 13 was a very familiar parable of Jesus telling about a sower who sowed his seed, and it landed on 4 different types of soil. And those represented 4 different types of attitudes, people's hearts, not all responding to God's love, God's message in the same way. But Jesus, going a little bit farther in the same context, told a related parable. He told about a man who had sowed seed, and then at night an enemy came and sowed some bad seed. And it became obvious before too long that there were both good plants and bad plants growing up together. And Jesus' disciples asked him later on, explain this parable to us. And in the explanation that Jesus provided, which is in Matthew 13, verses 36 through 43, Jesus said that the good seed is the seed of the kingdom, and the enemy that sows the bad seed is the devil. And particularly what I want us to consider right now is the fact that the devil, in sowing bad seed, has been involved since the early part of human history in instilling attitudes and values that are contrary to the will of God. And not only are they contrary to his will, but they're not good for us. One of the things that's important for us to understand as we study the scriptures and as we try to determine how these things relate to our lives is realizing that even though none of us particularly like to be told, you're not supposed to do that. We don't like to be corrected. We don't like to have to change the way we think or what we do. But the more we study God's Word, the more we really try to understand the principles that are involved in the things that he does and doesn't want us to do, the more obvious it is that God's just trying to keep us away from those things that do not build better relationships. They don't make us happier. They don't add to our lives. But rather in Romans chapter 1, where it talks about the results of people ignoring God and not doing his will, when God is not respected, people worship and serve the creature rather than the creator, as Paul describes it in Romans 1. The result there is that God said, if you don't want to listen to me, I'll let you do what you want. But those things do not make life better. The immorality and this disrespect for authority and all the different kinds of things that Paul describes there in Romans chapter 1, those are a result of not respecting God. And human relationships, behavior deteriorates when God is not given the respect that he's due. Because even when God has requirements, when God has prohibitions, when there are things that he expects and there are things that he forbids, it's all an expression of his love for us. There are things that he wants that are for our good. Satan, on the other hand, lies. He distorts, he misrepresents, and the kinds of things that he tries to get us to do are not the things that are in our best interest. Consider with me just a little bit that the kinds of things that Satan suggests in the very first meeting that we have with him in the book of Genesis, he's suggesting that God doesn't really mean what he says. When the serpent talked to Eve and we're asking about what the requirements, what the prohibitions might be, Eve knew exactly what God had said. God had said we can eat anything we want except for the fruit of that one tree he's forbidden. He said if we eat of that, we'll die. And Satan flatly contradicts that. He says, no, you won't. You won't die. And so first of all, he's indicating there that God doesn't really mean what he says. And in the second place, he's also indicating that God is keeping from you things that are good for you. He's saying to Eve, God knows that if you eat of that you're going to be like God, knowing good and evil. And he says that in a way that implies God's holding out on you. God's keeping you from something that you really ought to have. We know the reality was that when they ate the forbidden fruit, was there some truth in what Satan said? Yeah, they would know something that they hadn't known before. Satan had said, you'll know good and evil like God does. But knowing evil, it wasn't a positive thing. Satan is the one who introduced evil, evidently, in his relationship with God, and disrespecting him and destroying their relationship. And when Adam and Eve imitated his example of disrespecting God and doing what he told them not to do, rather than feeling like they had accomplished something good for them, they were ashamed. They were embarrassed. They went and hid themselves. And so, yes, they knew something they hadn't known before, but it certainly didn't make life better. What God does offer us is an opportunity to be more like him. And we don't accomplish that in a positive way by disrespecting him and by disobeying him. But rather in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, the Apostle Peter tells us that God has made, as a reflection of his own righteous nature, God has made promises to help us become like him, that we might become partakers of the divine nature. When we respect God, when we take seriously the things that he wants us to do, and trying to reflect the kind of character that he wants us to have, things get better. They don't get better when God is ignored and his will is disrespected. The second thing that Satan suggests as he's sowing tares, he's sowing weeds in our lives, is that God's unreasonable in what he expects. Now, Genesis chapter 4 doesn't say that in so many words, but the context indicates that this is what Satan is suggesting as he has affected the life of one of a pair of brothers. Cain and Abel had both been offering sacrifices to God. We know that God must have told them something as to what he wanted them to do, what he expected of them, because in Hebrews 11 we're told that Abel offered a better sacrifice than his brother by faith. Abel trusted God. He had reason for believing that if I do this in this way, God's going to be pleased. Cain offered a sacrifice. We're told that Abel was offering the best that he had. There's a quality description that is provided there in Genesis 4. Of Cain, it simply says that he brought of the fruit of the ground. Abel tried to bring the best out of faith. Abel just brought something. And I believe the context indicates, therefore, that Cain was doing something because he felt like he was obligated to. He had to. It wasn't something that his heart was in. It wasn't something he really felt like he wanted to do. Obviously, the way he handled things shows that he felt like God was expecting something that just didn't make any sense. It wasn't reasonable. Because since he offered something that wasn't in keeping with God's expectations, God himself gave Cain an opportunity to change that. He said, if you do well, won't you be accepted? Sin is crouching at the door, but you need to master it. And so God was showing his concern for a good relationship with Cain and saying, things aren't good the way they are, but you can change this. You can make this better. You can handle things in a way that will make you as acceptable as your brother is right now. And instead of doing that, instead of trying to say, Lord, I'm sorry you're disappointed in me, but I'll try harder to do right the next time. Instead, he let his resentment, his discontentment, his feeling like he'd been expected to do something that he really didn't want to do. He lashed out at his brother and saying, no, you're making me look bad, and so I'll just get rid of you. Satan tries to suggest that the kinds of things that God wants, no, they're not reasonable. But the reality is that God has shown his concern for people. God has blessed people. God has provided good things. And it's the natural response if we really think things through and consider what God has provided for us. Like in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus points out there that God sends rain and sunshine on the good and the bad, the righteous and the unrighteous. All of us live and breathe based on the kind of resources that God has provided. Whether we appreciate it or not, God has provided for our survival, our well-being. God has given us a lot of reason for being thankful. And Satan wants us to ignore that. We need to realize that it is not unreasonable for God to want us to make decisions that reflect our awareness of God as the Creator, recognizing our dependence upon him, and trying to show our gratitude by the way we live. A third thing that Satan suggests is that what we think isn't a big deal. It's okay for us to fantasize in our own minds, whether we're whatever kind of things we're talking about, particularly perhaps of a sexual nature, as long as we just think about things in our minds, but we don't actually act upon them, that everything's okay. And what Satan wants us to ignore and not consider carefully is that the more we think about certain things, the more likely it is that they're going to be reflected in our behavior. That's what Jesus was indicating in Matthew chapter 5 when he says, you know it's wrong to murder. But if you got hatred in your heart, if you're angry with your brother, that's the root of the problem. The person's in danger of the judgment when you let ill will, when you let resentments exist in your heart, because that's where wrong behavior starts. And Jesus goes on also in Matthew chapter 5 to say, you know it's wrong to commit adultery. You know it's wrong to have relations with somebody that's married to somebody else. But I'm telling you that if you lust after her, you've committed adultery already in your heart. In Matthew chapter 15, Jesus made it very clear that it's from the heart that come evil thoughts and murders and adulteries. Now, these are the things that mess up a person's life. It starts on the inside. And it's not true that as long as you just think about it, you look at somebody and you think about it and dwell on it, but as long as you don't ever do anything, then it's okay. Well, Jesus indicates that it's not. And there are people that want to feel like anything that's any fun, they've joked about it, said it's either illegal, immoral, or fattening. And it's not true that God is trying to keep us from enjoying life. God knows that there are things that are not in our best interest, and the only way to make sure that our behavior is what it ought to be is to make sure that we control things from the inside. We need to focus on our hearts, on our thoughts, our attitudes, and when our thinking is right, then our behavior is going to be right. And the best way to prevent wrong behavior is for us to make sure that we think about things that are appropriate. And when we are confronted with the possibility of an evil imagination, that's where we need to start to correct things. If you look back at Genesis chapter 6, excuse me, I'm sorry, I've got a dog back here that's making a lot of noise. In Genesis chapter 6, we're told about the generations of Noah, that God indicated there that the imagination of man's heart was only evil continually. Sorry, hold on just